A wilderness of shifting sand with only a few oases in the odd settlement, the Sinai Peninsula, the gateway between Africa and Asia, is an awesome desolation, approximately 24,000 square miles in size, triangular in shape, and surrounded by the Mediterranean Sea to the north, the Gulf of Suez to the west, and the Gulf of Akaba to the east. It is dominated by Mount Sinai at its southern edge, the place where Moses was said to have received the Ten Commandments, and venerated because of this by Christians, Jews, and Muslims alike. While technically still a state of the Ottoman Empire, Egypt had become a British protectorate when its ruler in Cairo was unable to pay the interest charges on loans he had taken out with Western creditors. In return for the settling of the nation's debt, Britain took control of the state bank, and it wasn't long before the British were running the rest of the country. The Ottoman Sultan in Constantinople, locked in a struggle with the Russians over the control of the Black Sea at the time, was powerless to stop the British takeover, but swore he would get his revenge. On the 2nd of September 1904, towards the end of the summer dry season, a camel caravan chanced upon something strange and peculiar in the vast emptiness of the eastern Sinai. A 10-foot wooden pole. Who had put it there and why was a mystery. The tribesmen described the wooden post to merchants at the various settlements they passed through. And news of the wooden post in the middle of nowhere reached Taba, an unassuming town hugging the Gulf of Akaba's northernmost reaches. The chief of police in Taba, one Abu Ney, was so bored he went out into the desert, found a piece of wood which was clearly some sort of boundary marker, and wrote a report which he sent to his boss in the city of Suez. Abu's report was hastily forwarded to the Egyptian capital, Cairo. On the 7th of September, Cairo dispatched a light airship with orders to conduct aerial reconnaissance of the wooden pole. Somehow, the airship located the pole and photographed it. Before leaving, the British airship encountered a light zeppelin of the Ottoman Air Force, also sent to take photographs, for news of the newly discovered boundary marker had reached Ottoman officials in Damascus. When the two flying machines had gone, out of the desert appeared 24 camel riders who circled the enigmatic boundary marker before vanishing once more into the desert. The British believed that the boundary marker had been put there by the Ottomans, while the Ottomans believed that the post had been erected by the British. The British considered the erecting of the boundary marker a gross provocation and an encroachment into Egyptian territory. The Ottomans viewed the matter in the same manner, only to them it was the British who had clearly encroached into Ottoman territory, the boundary marker being the latest attempt by the British to slice off another part of their empire. The British government lodged a diplomatic protest in Constantinople over the boundary marker. The Ottoman embassy in London did the same. The suggestion by the French that perhaps some third party had placed the boundary marker to sow animosity between the two great nations was dismissed. Rather than just remove the offending piece of wood, both the British and the Ottomans wanted to keep it where it was as evidence of the other's evil intentions. In hindsight, it might have been wiser if they had just knocked the thing over and forgotten about it. On the 9th of September, London advised Cairo to send a small military expedition to the boundary marker. 2 sections of Egyptian soldiers, around 20 men, led by a Sergeant Ali Salah, seen here on the far left, was quickly dispatched, along with the British Inspector of the Sinai, Sir W.E. Francis. Sir Francis and Sergeant Ali arrived at the boundary marker on the 12th of September. There they encountered an Ottoman officer mounted on a camel with his own body of men. Sir Francis and Sergeant Ali approached the Ottoman officer to discuss the situation. The Ottoman officer remained sat on his camel for the duration of the meeting. Sir Francis introduced himself and Sergeant Ali and explained that they had been sent by the government of Egypt, and that since they were currently in Egyptian territory, to avoid an international incident, the Ottoman officer and his men should leave the area at their earliest convenience. The Ottoman officer said that he was 2nd Lieutenant Ozan of the 130th Infantry Regiment, 2nd Division, 1st Corps, 4th Army, and that he had been ordered to his present position by a Major Emin, the military governor of Akaba, and that since the area was under Ottoman authority, it was in fact Sir Francis who ought to leave to avoid an international incident. Sir Francis politely declined to do so. Sergeant Ali thought it best to say nothing. Having reached an impasse, the meeting ended. Both parties wished the other a good day and withdrew a short distance from the boundary marker to where their men were lying in the sand. Sir Francis had the tents Ali and his men had brought from Port Suez put up. Then Sir Francis had his fancy writing desk, a family heirloom, also carried to the middle of nowhere by Ali's men, set up inside his tent. When that was done, Sir Francis invited 2nd Lieutenant Ozan over for tea. 2nd Lieutenant Ozan respectfully declined, set up his own tents, and invited the British Inspector of the Sinai over for coffee and some Turkish delight. The invitation was also respectfully declined. A formal request was made by the Egyptian authorities for 2nd Lieutenant Ozan and his men to leave. The Ottomans made similar demands. On the 12th of September, 2nd Lieutenant Ozan raised the Ottoman flag over his 2 tents. Sir Francis immediately wrote to Cairo informing them of the development. Egyptian and British representatives lodged formal complaints over such provocative action and demanded the offending flag be taken down immediately. The Ottomans refused. London newspapers reported the diplomatic spat briefly. In response to the raising of the flag, Cairo sent a company of British soldiers to St. Catherine's Monastery at the foot of Mount Sinai, and instructed Sir Francis to raise the Union Jack over his tent. This Sir Francis did while singing the national anthem and feeling a little out of his depth. Sergeant Ali and his men were unable to sing along as they didn't know the words. As the diplomatic standoff continued, tribesmen appeared suddenly out of the desert and set up their own camp near the boundary marker. Sir Francis asked Sergeant Alley what he thought they wanted. Sergeant Alley thought it best to say nothing. On the 14th, more Egyptian troops arrived at the boundary marker and additional tents were put up. The Ottomans were similarly reinforced the next day and also put up additional tents. On the 16th, a sandstorm blew into the area around the boundary marker and lasted for 3 days. Some of the Egyptian soldiers stationed there prayed to Allah that the boundary marker would be blown away so they could go back to Port Suez. But when the storm had passed, the boundary marker and all the political turmoil it was causing remained. The next day, 2nd Lieutenant Ozan received fresh orders from Akaba. He and his men were to dig a trench on his side of the boundary marker. 2nd Lieutenant Ozan's men soon got to work, and by the 19th the trench was finished and the Ottoman soldiers clambered in, while 2nd Lieutenant Ozan decided to stay on his camel. The Ottomans have drawn a line in the sand and put troops in it, the British Prime Minister declared when he heard the latest news from the Sinai. The British Foreign Minister supposed that they had. Threats and recriminations were made. Diplomatic noses were put out of joint. Claiming to be a friend of both the British and Ottoman empires, France proposed both sides withdraw 10 miles, but neither the British or the Ottomans were interested. The British ambassador in Constantinople proposed the Ottomans pull back their forces in return for financial compensation, but the suggestion was quickly rebuffed. Why should the forces of the Ottoman Empire pull back when they were on their own territory? The Ottomans offered London 2 islands in the Red Sea if they accepted the boundary marker as the official border between Egypt and the Ottoman Empire. The British refused. In response to the growing tensions, Cairo, with approval from London, decided to send British troops to the boundary marker. A platoon, some 30 men, of the 27th Lancashire Fusiliers, commanded by Lieutenant Hickory, set off across the desert. Sir Francis, his writing desk, and the Egyptian troops were ordered back to Port Suez. On the journey home, Sir Francis told Sergeant Alley of his intentions to resign, move to a little fishing village in Cornwall, and get into basket weaving. Sergeant Alley, who would go on himself to become a famous folk singer, thought it best to say nothing. Back at the boundary marker, Lieutenant Hickory opened his sealed orders. The 27th Fusiliers were to dig their own trench and to defend it with their lives if necessary. Things were getting out of hand. On the 22nd of September, in classic gunboat diplomacy style, the Admiralty in London ordered the cruiser HMS Arrogant, captained by Lieutenant Commander Wilson and part of the British Mediterranean Fleet, into the Gulf of Akaba. HMS Arrogant dropped anchor around 50 miles southeast of the boundary marker. Nearby was Pharaoh's Island, a small island some 500 meters offshore, crowned with the remains of a Crusader fort built in 1115 to protect Christian pilgrims traveling between Jerusalem and St. Catherine's Monastery at the foot of Mount Sinai. The boundary between Egypt and the rest of the Ottoman Empire had always been somewhat vague. Most experts held that Egyptian rule extended in a straight line from the city of Suez to the city of Rafah. However, the ruler of Egypt had always been permitted to garrison locations beyond this line in order to protect pilgrims going to or returning from Mecca. There were all sorts of other exceptions and ambiguities. Things were as clear as mud or sand. While such a vague state of affairs had been perfectly acceptable to both the Egyptians and to the Ottomans, to the British, the new rulers in Egypt, it was not. For the British liked their colonies to be neat and tidy. There was another reason for British hypersensitivity over the boundary marker. The Suez Canal, upon its completion in 1869, was of enormous strategic value to the British, cutting travelling time and thus fuel costs to her distant colonies. The British Admiralty regarded the canal as the most important possession of the empire. Believing were they ever to lose control of the canal, they would also lose control of the Indian subcontinent and their assets in the Far East. British High Command viewed the Sinai as an ideal buffer zone, allowing them to defend the canal in depth from any eastern threats. Accordingly, they would not give up the Sinai without a fight. The Ottomans, for their part, were tired of being regarded as the sick man of Europe. Standing up to the British in the Sinai would show the world that the Ottoman Empire still had some fight in it. Luckily, the war with Russia had entered a period of stalemate. The Ottoman Sultan also suspected that if he was not seen to be firm with the British, his military might take matters into their own hands. So it was that both sides felt they had little option but to continue to raise the stakes, both hoping the other would blink first. On the 23rd, Cairo received reports from the British Admiralty of a sizable Ottoman naval force consisting of at least 3 capital ships and their escorts having steamed through the Tehran Strait, the narrow passageway connecting the Red Sea to the Gulf of Akaba, and having successfully navigated the reefs there. On the 24th of September, 2 Ottoman biplanes from Akaba flew down the Gulf, coming within machine gun range of HMS Arrogant. No shots, however, were fired. On the same day, Damascus sent a Prussian-made landship from the 55th Cavalry Regiment to the boundary marker to help protect Ottoman interests there. The 55th Cavalry Regiment only having recently replaced their horses for steam-powered contraptions. The Ottoman landship broke down twice but reached its destination on the 25th. To counter the arrival of the Ottoman war machine, Cairo dispatched a squadron of the 12th Lancers with their own light-class landships. Landship squadrons, in this period, normally consisted of 3 machines. The Lancers arrived on the 5th of October. On the 8th of October, a flotilla of Ottoman corvettes arrived to keep an eye on the British cruiser. As the corvettes approached, HMS Arrogant fired a warning shot. and the Ottoman ships came no closer. In Constantinople, officials objected in the strongest terms to such irresponsible action on the part of the British. British diplomats said that the captain had simply been following orders and would fire again if the Ottomans got too close. On the 10th, Damascus ordered 3 squadrons of light landships from the 55th Cavalry Regiment to head to the boundary marker, and these arrived on the 11th. Cairo responded by sending 2 more squadrons of their own light landships to the boundary marker. The British garrison in Egypt, known as the Egyptian Expeditionary Force, to distinguish it from Egyptian army formations, consisted at the time of some 7,000 men organized into a single corps made up of 2 divisions. Corps HQ was in Cairo, while 1st Division was deployed in and around Port Said to guard against any attack from the north. 2nd Division was garrisoned outside the port city of Suez and along the canal itself. It was from the 2nd Division that most of the British forces involved in the Taba Crisis would be drawn. Ottoman forces that took part in the crisis came from the 4th Army's 1st Corps. 4th Army was composed of some 24,000 men, with its headquarters in Damascus. 1st Corps was based in the Arabian towns and cities along the Red Sea coast as far north as Akaba, as well as the holy city of Medina. 4th Army 2nd Corps protected the Mediterranean ports of Haifa and Beirut, and guarded the northern Sinai. While 4th Army's headquarters was in Damascus, some 300 miles from the disputed boundary marker, its 1st Corps had a well-developed base in the port city of Akaba, which was less than 100 miles from the boundary marker. The distance from Port Suez to the boundary marker was around 200 miles, making the sending of supplies and reinforcements harder for the British than it was for the Ottomans. On the 14th, Damascus sent 6 more light landship squadrons of the 55th to the boundary marker, putting a Major Khan in overall command. When news of the Ottoman reinforcements reached Cairo, the British dispatched 3 more of their own light landship squadrons under the command of a Captain Jenkins, seen here on the right. Captain Jenkins would take over from Lieutenant Hickory, despite the fact that Captain Jenkins was completely deaf as a result of some Chinese dragon guns he had encountered in the Far East. What was becoming known in the papers as the Taba Crisis continued, with no end in sight. The French proposed sending its own peacekeeping force, but both the British and the Ottomans rejected the idea out of hand. The last thing the Sinai needed was another army. To the men of the 27th Fusiliers, who had now been sitting in their trench at the boundary marker for some time, it often felt, at night particularly, as if the British Empire had established a military outpost on the surface of the moon. On the 15th, following consultations with their masters in Constantinople, Damascus upped the stakes by sending to the boundary marker one of their new medium land ships. The beast arrived on the 16th to cheers from the Ottoman infantry. In response to the Ottoman medium land ship, Cairo felt it had little option but to order in one of its own older mediums. On board was Major Sykes, who was to take over command from Captain Jenkins, who had, according to reports, been staring at the desert for long periods of time and had become blind as well as deaf as a result. The deployment of so much force to the eastern Sinai was playing havoc with the larger military plans of both high commands. Far worse was the fact that two ever-growing armies were facing off against each other at very close range. The danger was enormous. Should an action by one side be misinterpreted by the other, a ghastly and costly mistake might follow. Yet neither side was willing to de-escalate. Too much sand had passed under the bridge for that. And all because of a piece of wood. After its escorts had been fired on, Constantinople dispatched a flotilla of frigates to the waters around Pharaoh's island. The warships arrived on the morning of the 18th of October. The British cruiser HMS Arrogant was now outnumbered 6-1. While the Ottoman Navy built up its forces in the Gulf of Akaba, Damascus ordered the deployment of yet more steam-powered armoured units to the boundary marker itself, sending 9 additional light squadrons from the 55th Cavalry Regiment, 2 more medium land ships, and a battery of self-propelled howitzers from the 45th Armoured Regiment. These new forces took up position on the 20th. More British assets were quickly dispatched to the Sinai to even the odds. 9 more light squadrons, 2 more medium land ships, and a battery of elephant guns from India arrived on the 24th. Exactly how the elephant guns would fare against the more advanced Ottoman howitzers was anybody's guess. Lieutenant Colonel Philby replaced Major Sykes as Commander-in-Chief following an inspection of the 27th Fusiliers. Lieutenant Colonel Philby's arrival coincided with the tribesman camp at the disputed boundary marker growing in size. What this meant, if it meant anything at all, no one knew. The British troops took it as a bad sign. In the Gulf of Akaba, Lieutenant Commander Wilson received new orders from the British Admiral. Thankfully, no shots were fired as HMS Arrogant steamed brazenly past the line of hostile vessels, making its way to Pharaoh's Island. Once HMS Arrogant was near enough, the ship's marine contingent climbed the island's rocky face. Then they entered the Crusader fort, took up defensive positions on the ancient ramparts, and raised the Union Jack. With its orders now carried out, HMS Arrogant reversed engines and steamed back to its original position. Lieutenant Commander Wilson had pulled off a highly risky maneuver in the face of the enemy without incident. His daring action was front-page news in London. Plucky British warship liberates vital island, read one headline. Daring naval officer takes enemy fort, declared another. The Queen was said to be amused. Constantinople, of course, complained bitterly, and the Ottoman delegation to the talks in Paris tried to leave the city, but got caught in heavy traffic, gave up, and returned to their hotel room. 2 days after Lieutenant Commander Wilson celebrated taking of Pharaoh's Island, the tribesman camp at the boundary marker vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. British troops took it as another bad sign. On the 24th, Damascus sent more armoured forces to the boundary marker. 3 light landship squadrons from the 55th Cavalry Regiment, 2 medium landship squadrons, and a heavy landship, all from the 45th Armoured Regiment, 1st Corps, 4th Army, and 2 light zeppelins to act as artillery spotters and air defense. One of the medium squadrons joined their sister ships in the center, while the second medium squadron moved behind the mass of light landships on the Ottoman left. The heavy landship, which dwarfed even the massive mediums, deployed centrally. The new light landship squadrons took up position on the Ottoman right flank. In overall command of the Ottoman forces at the disputed boundary marker now was Lieutenant Colonel Simlek, only recently back from the war with the Russians. On the 31st, without warning, a squadron of Ottoman medium Zeppelins based at Akaba Air Base flew down the Gulf in attack formation. The drone of their engines filled the air as they made straight for Pharaoh's Island. The British Marines in the fort prepared for the worst, taking shelter in the dungeon. But the flying contraptions dropped their bombs harmlessly into the sea after they had flown over the island. An intentional miss. The Zeppelin squadron then returned to its base, and the British Marines manned the walls of the Crusader fort once more. On the 2nd of November, with the crisis worsening day by day, the French proposed the setting up of a boundary commission for the Sinai. A meeting was held in Paris to discuss the details. Prospects for a breakthrough looked good. But when neither the British or Ottoman delegations showed up, the French went home early. Two days later, Cairo dispatched Major Green from Port Suez to the boundary marker with another light squadron and two medium squadrons. Major Green and his men made good time and arrived on the 4th. Lieutenant Colonel Philby remained in overall command. The mediums deployed centrally, while the light squadron from the 4th Hussars took up position on the British left, as per Lieutenant Colonel Philby's orders. Philby's forces were still inferior to the Ottomans, and he requested further support. At the very least, he needed something to counter the Ottoman heavy landship should shells start to fly. Aware that HMS Arrogant was seriously outnumbered in the Gulf of Akaba, the British Admiralty in London searched frantically for ships to come to her aid. While Britain was a global superpower, she had so many military commitments around the world, she found herself during the Taba Crisis often having to play catch-up with the Ottomans, both on land and at sea. As an interim measure, a light airship, HMS Nuisance, under the command of Captain Maxwell, was ordered to the Gulf. While her guns would be of limited assistance, Nuisance's arrival would, it was hoped, boost the morale of HMS Arrogant and the Marines on Pharaoh's Island. HMS Nuisance joined HMS Arrogant on the 5th and took up station on her landward side. After much arm pulling, the French were able to get both sides in the Taba Crisis to attend their first face-to-face meeting. It did not go well. Both the British and the Ottoman delegations exchanged insults and then tried to storm out at the same time, banging into each other in the doorway as they tried to make their dramatic exits. As the political squabbling in Paris went on, the military build-up far away in the Sinai continued. On the 6th, Cairo gave in to Philby's pleas for more reinforcements, sending him 2 more light squadrons from the 4th Hussars, another medium squadron, and a heavy. The armoured column was commanded by Captain Henry, and it reached the boundary marker without incident on the 9th of November to the cheers of the 27th Fusiliers who were still manning their trench. The heavy landship took up position in the British front line next to the mediums. The Hussars joined their comrades on the far left, while the newly arrived mediums joined the second line of war machines. Lieutenant Colonel Philby now had more combat power than the Ottomans, but his advantage was slim at best, and no doubt it wouldn't be long before the Ottomans sent their own reinforcements. Hundreds of soldiers were now gathered around a wooden pole that had been put there by a mysterious someone for a reason equally mysterious. It wasn't even certain that the boundary marker was in fact a boundary marker at all. For on the 7th, archaeologists in Luxor had put forward the theory at an international conference that the boundary marker might in fact be nothing more than a burial pole dating back to the 19th dynasty. since neither side was prepared to let the other inspect the boundary marker. The archaeologists' interesting theory was to remain untested. It wasn't just in the Sinai desert that things appeared to be racing out of control. In the Gulf of Akaba, Ottoman Naval Command had sent 2 cruisers with escorts to the standoff with HMS Arrogant and HMS Nuisance, placing a Captain Akbas in overall command. Should Captain Akbas decide to attack, both British vessels would quickly be defeated and the fort on Pharaoh's Island easily captured. The resulting loss to British prestige would be serious. Had the Royal Navy bitten off more than it could chew? Back in France, political progress was being made, if slowly. Thanks to the behind-the-scenes intervention by the Italians and the Americans, both sides in the crisis had now agreed in principle to the composition of the proposed Boundary Marker Commission, and its scope. The commission was to be made up of both Ottoman and Egyptian diplomats. All that remained was for the 2 sides to agree on the officials from both countries that would make up the commission. On the 12th, a white smudge appeared on the desert near the boundary marker. Many of the 4th Hussars, who were nearest and saw it first, wagered it was but a mirage. But mirage it was not. The strange white smudge was in fact a mass of camel-riding tribesmen belonging to the Jafu tribe. At their head was the leader of their clan, Chief Badem Umet. Umet had heard of the 2 mighty armies that were gathering in the desert, all because of some worthless stick. And, it was said, he had left his stronghold in central Sinai to see these strange things with his own eyes. Lieutenant Colonel Philby invited Chief Umet aboard his flagship for a tour. Umet declined the invitation, explaining that he and his people regarded all land ships as the work of the devil. On the 13th, in the Gulf of Akaba, HMS Subterfuge, a British submarine under the command of Captain Nicholson, surfaced behind the 2 Ottoman cruisers. At any moment the submarine could have launched its torpedoes and very likely sank both ships. It was the best the Admiralty could do for the time being. HMS Arrogant and HMS Nuisance, still facing down nearly a dozen enemy surface ships, were thankful for any help they could get. On the 15th, Damascus sent the following additional forces from 4th Army to the boundary post: 1 light squadron from the 55th, 3 medium squadrons, 2 more batteries of mobile howitzers, 2 more heavy land ships from the 45th and 129th Armoured Regiments, and the squadron of medium Zeppelins that had recently flown over Pharaoh's Island. In command of these sizable reinforcements was General Zorlu, who was to take over command from Lieutenant Colonel Simlik when he reached the boundary post. The Ottoman Sultan apparently wasn't sure of Simlik's loyalty. General Zorlu and his forces arrived on the 16th and took up position. The 2 artillery batteries joined the other battery in the rear to provide indirect fire to the front rank units. 1 medium land ship squadron deployed on the Ottoman left behind the light land ships, while the other medium squadron formed a second line in the center. The medium Zeppelins dropped anchor on the far right of the Ottoman line, and the 2 heavy land ships lumbered next to their sister ship, forming a heavy land ship squadron. A trooper of the 4th Hussars suggested someone just chop the boundary marker in 2, give one half to the Ottoman Sultan and the other half to Her Majesty the Queen, and be done with it. On the 18th, an Ottoman dreadnought made its appearance near Pharaoh's Island. On board the enormous vessel was Rear Admiral Kadim, who had been ordered to take control of all Ottoman naval assets in the area. Rear Admiral Kadim did not hang around. His first action upon arriving was to have his dreadnought steam at full speed towards HMS Subterfuge. The threat of such a giant ramming the submarine was too great for Captain Nicholson to risk, and he ordered his ship to quickly dive. The dreadnought sailed over the waters HMS Subterfuge had last been seen in. One of the dreadnought's escort ships dropping a depth charge. Rear Admiral Kadim then ordered his dreadnought steam on towards Pharaoh's Island, where he gave the British Marines an ultimatum. They had 2 hours to leave or he would blow the fort to smithereens. With an hour to go before Rear Admiral Kadim's deadline, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell of HMS Nuisance took action. He flew to the Crusader fort and picked up the Marines before returning to his starting position on the left of HMS Arrogant. The entire operation had taken less than 10 minutes and every Marine was safe and accounted for. As soon as the British Marines had been flown off the island, Ottoman Marines from the dreadnought, equipped with rocket packs, took control of the fort and raised the Ottoman flag. News of the Ottoman ultimatum and the taking of Pharaoh's Island was greeted with shocking dismay in London. The Queen was said not to be amused. The papers and public opinion, needing a scapegoat, settled on Lieutenant Commander Wilson of the Arrogant, who had done nothing as the scandalous events had unfolded. "Naval officer gives in without a fight," read the headline of the same newspaper that a few weeks before had praised Wilson as the new Nelson. In Constantinople the news was met with delight, and military bands played patriotic songs long into the night. As the political fallout of the Pharaoh Island debacle played out, Cairo sent a Captain Boyd with a medium airship and a squadron of light airships to help neutralize the threat the Ottoman Zeppelins posed. The British airships reached the boundary post in record time and took up station near the 4th Hussars opposite the Ottoman medium Zeppelins. On the 20th of October, having taken its fair share of blame for the Pharaoh's Island fiasco, the Admiralty was finally able to make good its promise of sending serious firepower to the Gulf of Akaba. HMS Overkill was a super dreadnought Titan class and possessed a ridiculous number of gun turrets. On Overkill's bridge was Vice Admiral Jones. As the super dreadnought, escorted by a light airship squadron, came into view, it made HMS Arrogant look like a minnow. Even Rear Admiral Kadim's dreadnought appeared no match for the newly arrived British warship. HMS Overkill dropped anchor close to HMS Arrogant, and Lieutenant Commander Wilson was invited aboard the great ship for dinner. It was an invitation Wilson was happy to accept. In Paris, the diplomatic solution seemed in sight. All that needed to happen was for the British and the Ottomans to accept each other's candidates for the commission. But both sides rejected the other candidates as too political, and new lists of candidates would have to be drawn up. On the 23rd, a sandstorm struck the Sinai, and visibility dropped to just a few feet. Had the Jafu tribesmen or the Ottomans launched a sneak attack under the cover of the sandstorm, the British would have been overrun. But no such attack came. As soon as conditions permitted, more armour left Port Suez and headed east to the boundary post. The new reinforcements consisted of one light squadron made up of the 4th Hussars and 2 heavy landships from the 45th, which had been shipped by barge down the canal. In the lead heavy landship was Brigadier Ramsey, recently involved in major hostilities in the Khyber Pass and now Commander-in-Chief of all British forces stationed in eastern Sinai. The 2 heavy landships deployed centrally next to their sister ship, meaning that the British now had a heavy landship squadron of their own, while the light landships of the Hussars joined their comrades on the British right. Brigadier Ramsay sent a message to General Zulu requesting the two meet at the boundary marker at noon. Brigadier Ramsay walked around the wooden pole again and again, explaining the British position. General Zulu told him he would get dizzy. Brigadier Ramsay politely suggested General Zulu withdraw his forces a few miles east. General Zulu said that unfortunately that would not be possible. "Why don't you withdraw your forces just a few miles?" General Zulu asked. The British brigadier smiled and said nothing. Sand, indifferent to their military rank, began to cover both men's boots. Brigadier Ramsay suggested, to help pass the time, that they play a game of chess. Zulu, who had been a keen player since military college, agreed. A British orderly came forward and laid a chessboard out on the sand, and then rather nervously took chess pieces from the pockets of his khaki uniform and placed them on the chessboard. When the chessboard was ready, the orderly fetched 2 foldable chairs and a pair of sunshades. As the two were about to start playing, Brigadier Ramsay proposed that whoever lost would march his army 20 miles back from their current position. General Zulu thought for a moment and then agreed. Afterwards, both men claimed to have won. Who actually won has never been established. There is, of course, the possibility that the game ended in a draw, or that it was never in fact completed. Whether Brigadier Ramsay had been serious, Cairo and London could not be sure. Whether his proposal was some sort of trick or the result of shell shock sustained in the Northern Territories, no one could say. Whatever the case, deciding the fate of empires by the outcome of a game just wasn't cricket. Cairo and London agreed to relieve Ramsay of command. Thankfully, the whole thing was kept out of the papers, and the public at the time never got wind of the Brigadier's wager. Lieutenant Colonel Philby was to be acting commander-in-chief until another general could be found. When Ramsay was informed by Philby that Cairo was relieving him and putting him back in command, Ramsay proposed another game of chess, the winner of which would take command. Philby had Ramsay confined to his quarters and confiscated his chessboard. While the British high-ups were dealing with the chess scandal, Constantinople responded to the arrival of HMS Overkill. On the 25th, an Ottoman carrier group arrived in the waters around Pharaoh's Island. The carrier group consisted of 3 corvettes, 2 additional cruisers, and a carrier with dozens of biplanes below its decks. The carrier group took up station at the rear of the Ottoman fleet, from where it would be able to provide air cover to the other Ottoman vessels. Vice Admiral Jones reported the development to London, requesting 2 additional super dreadnoughts to teach the Ottomans a lesson, as he put it. British forces in the Sinai Desert, still reeling from the sudden and unexplained dismissal of Brigadier Ramsay, were soon greeted with more bad news. Escorted by a squadron of light land ships from the 55th Cavalry Regiment, a second Ottoman carrier had made its way overland with the help of its bizarre system of mechanical legs to the boundary marker. On board was Major General Durmaz, who was now overall commander of Ottoman forces at the boundary marker. Apparently the Sultan had not been impressed by the chess scandal either. Vice Admiral Jones's request for 2 more super dreadnoughts so he could teach the Ottomans a lesson was simply impractical given the Royal Navy's wider commitments. The best the Admiralty could do was to send HMS Subterfuge, which had avoided destruction from the depth charge on the 18th, and HMS Deceitful. The pair of submarines surfaced behind the Ottoman carrier. Had Brigadier Ramsay been present, he might have declared the move a checkmate. While these events were unfolding in the Gulf, Cairo had been busy scrambling around for a suitable replacement for Brigadier Ramsay. All the best generals, it would seem, had already been taken. Then, on the 28th, they decided on their man and sent him off in all haste aboard a land carrier. General Winkworth was given strict instructions not to play any sort of board game with the Ottoman High Command. General Winkworth, who was more of a card player anyway, agreed. General Winkworth and the land carrier arrived at the boundary marker on the 3rd of November. The land carrier deployed centrally behind the British front line to provide air cover to the entire force, while the 4th Hussars deployed on the British left. On the 4th, news broke in Paris that membership of the Boundary Commission had been agreed to by both the British and the Ottomans. War had been averted. The Taba Crisis would be resolved peacefully around a table. There would be no need for bloodshed. Peace had won. Progress had won. A silly and unnecessary war had been averted. The troops would soon be back in their barracks and the wooden post in the middle of nowhere forgotten about. Around 11 in the morning of the 5th of November, the day after the political breakthrough in Paris, across the waters of the Gulf of Akaba, distant gunfire could be heard. Believing the super dreadnought Overkill was under attack, Captain Nicholson of the British Navy decided to act. HMS Subterfuge and HMS Deceitful fired 4 torpedoes at the Ottoman carrier. Two of the torpedoes struck the carrier, while the other 2 ran under the massive vessel, one hitting an escort cruiser doing significant damage. The Ottoman carrier started to take on water. Worse, fires caused by the torpedoes meant that the biplanes still aboard were unable to take off for the duration of the action that was to follow. The carrier's escort corvettes turned tightly and fired on the British subs, as did the carrier's port turret. The escort scored a number of hits. Then 2 biplanes from the Ottoman carrier, already airborne, strafed the British submarines, doing yet more damage. HMS Deceitful made an emergency dive. HMS Subterfuge, dead in the water, remained on the surface. Seeing the British submarines being attacked, Vice Admiral Jones ordered HMS Overkill's crew to battle stations, weighed anchor, and steamed forward, firing at the Ottoman frigates in front of him. Overkill's opening salvo destroyed 1 frigate and badly damaged another. The British airships then engaged and sank one of the Ottoman corvettes. HMS Arrogant also fired at the corvettes but missed. Then HMS Overkill fired its port turrets at the corvettes and sank one. The Ottoman dreadnought and a swarm of escort ships steamed forward and fired at HMS Overkill. doing significant damage. The Ottoman carrier was unable to fire on overkill due to the position of a friendly cruiser, but one of its escort cruisers was able to fire at overkill, but did no damage. Although several fires now raged on her decks and many of her gun turrets had been knocked out, HMS Overkill steamed on towards two Ottoman cruisers. The captains of the two Ottoman cruisers HMS Overkill was steaming directly towards took very different courses of action. The cruiser to Overkill's port tried to steer out of the way, while the cruiser to starboard fired its guns and prepared to ram. The two warships collided. Given the enormous size difference, it was no surprise that the Ottoman cruiser came off worse, sinking almost immediately. Flying over the remaining Ottoman corvettes, two of the British airships were hit by anti-aircraft fire and crashed into the sea. Still on fire, HMS Overkill rammed an enemy corvette, which promptly headed to the bottom of the Gulf of Akaba. The super dreadnought then unleashed its guns on the escort cruiser already damaged by the stray torpedo and sunk it. HMS Arrogant, following in Overkill's sizable wake, fired at the enemy vessels all around her, but failed to damage any. HMS Overkill was then attacked by the Ottoman biplanes and sustained yet more damage. At this critical moment in the engagement, HMS Arrogant suffered a sudden loss of pressure in its engine. This meant it couldn't keep up with Overkill. No longer shielded by her big sister, HMS Arrogant came under sustained bombardment from most of the enemy fleet. And she quickly keeled over. The Ottoman dreadnought's stern turret took a potshot at HMS Overkill, but failed to find the range. Trying to avoid a head-on collision with the British super dreadnought, the Ottoman carrier veered to port, which meant that the carrier's main guns could not fire on Overkill. But the carrier's starboard gun turret and its remaining escort cruiser ripped more holes in the super dreadnought, which was starting to look worse for wear. Deciding that the British submarines were no longer a threat, the carrier's corvette escorts steamed back to the Ottoman capital ship. With many of its guns having been knocked out, and with raging infernos across its hull, HMS Overkill attempted to limp away. The few gun turrets that remained operational were able to cause more damage to the Ottoman carrier as it steamed past. But Overkill's single stern gun turret, in hindsight something of a design flaw, failed to hit an enemy cruiser in its sights. Rear Admiral Kadim wanted to clear the area as badly as Vice Admiral Jones, so as to have more room to maneuver and to ascertain the damage his fleet had sustained. The Ottoman carrier's port escort cruiser fired at Overkill but failed to find the range. While the carrier's starboard gun turret scored another hit on the British monster. HMS Overkill somehow steamed on. Everyone, including Vice Admiral Jones, wondered how long it could possibly stay afloat. The super dreadnought and the carrier exchanged fire once more. But neither side hit the other. The Ottoman fleet headed south. Rear Admiral Kadim perhaps ought to have ordered his forces to turn north and finish off HMS Overkill. But Kadim was concerned about the damage to his carrier, which turned out not to be as bad as first feared. And there was also the matter of the British submarines. Thanks to Admiral Kadim's caution, HMS Overkill and Vice Admiral Jones both lived to fight another day. The Ottomans considered the Battle of Pharaoh's Island, as the brief action became known, as a victory, and medals were awarded accordingly. The British Admiralty considered it more of a draw. General Dermers always maintained after the battle that he had heard sounds of gunfire from the Gulf before he ordered his forces to attack. But his account is hard to reconcile with HMS Subterfuge's commander Captain Nicholson's account, for how could they both have heard the other's battle commence before their own? A Syrian meteorologist has recently put forward the idea that what both men might have heard in fact was a thunderclap from a storm in the Red Sea at the time. Whatever his reason, General Durmaz on board the Ottoman carrier ordered the enormous machine to lurch forward and fire its guns at the nearest British heavy landship. The guns spoke and the carrier scored a number of telling hits. General Durmaz then ordered the carrier's biplanes to take off and launch an attack on Captain Boyd's medium airship. The airship's anti-aircraft guns accounted for one of the Ottoman biplanes as they closed. But the airship was soon critically damaged and crashed into the sand below. The British had been caught with their khaki-coloured shorts down. Then the Ottoman heavy landship squadron steamed forward and fired in turn at the British heavies. Their devastating close-range fire knocked out two of the massive machines. Ottoman medium landships advanced in their squadrons, firing at the British mediums in front of them and destroying one. On the Ottoman left, 55th Cavalry squadrons advanced, firing. Wrecking 9 of the Dragoons and Lancers light landships. While medium landships of the 45th Armoured Regiment behind the lights of the 55th fired in support over the smaller machines and accounted for another 3 British light landships. On the Ottoman right flank, the Zeppelins raised anchor and attacked the 4th Hussars. Knocking out a number of their landships. The stunned 4th Hussars were then charged by the Jafru tribesmen. Chief Umet, it seemed, had decided to throw in his lot with his fellow Muslims rather than with the Christian infidels. Dozens of tribesmen fell to the Hussars' guns as they charged. Violent hand-to-hand fighting followed, and a number of the light landships were boarded and their crew put to the sword. As the fighting on the Ottoman right raged, 2 batteries of Ottoman howitzers fired at the British carrier. And damaged it. The 3rd Ottoman howitzer battery targeted the British elephant guns, knocking out 2 and sending the elephant stampeding madly into the desert. Caught off guard by the sudden opening of hostilities, the British landships that were still operational fought back. The last remaining heavy British landship fired at one of the Ottoman heavies, before withdrawing behind one of its burning sister ships. Thanks to this maneuver of the British heavy, General Winkworth's carrier now had a clear line of sight to the enemy heavy and was able to take it out. General Winkworth then ordered the carrier to retreat and for the biplanes to get airborne and deal with the Ottoman artillery. British biplanes had soon flown over both armies and strafed the first enemy battery they came across, putting it out of commission. The Ottoman heavy landships steamed forward, guns blazing. The first damaged the last British heavy. The second fired at some British mediums, but to little effect. Using its bombards, General Dermaz's carrier fired indirectly at the British carrier and did yet more damage, while its side turrets targeted a medium landship, but did little damage. Having taken out the medium airship, the Ottoman biplanes turned their attention to its escorts, shooting down two, before heading off to deal with the British biplanes causing havoc in the Ottoman rear area. On the Ottoman left, the elephant guns that remained fired into the Ottoman light landships bearing down on the British line, and knocked out 3 of the machines. The Zeppelins on the Ottoman right dropped more bombs onto the 4th Hussars, destroying half a dozen light landships. The Hussar commanding officer ordered a fighting retreat. As the light landships pulled back, they fired into the massed ranks of the Jafu, who were momentarily confused by their enemy's withdrawal. The Ottoman howitzers that remained silenced the British elephant guns. Two British medium landships in the center of the battlefield advanced and then turned to starboard to improve the line of sight of the medium squadron behind them. This rearward squadron fired at the lead Ottoman heavy landship and wrecked it. The two lead mediums then engaged the squadron of enemy mediums. but were unable to do any significant damage. In response, the Ottoman mediums steamed forward towards the 27th Fusiliers in their trench. The plucky Fusiliers fired everything they had at the nearest enemy landship, but their rifles were no match for the monster, and their bullets bounced harmlessly off its armour. The advancing Ottoman mediums ignored the Fusiliers, pouring all their fire into the British mediums behind. Destroying one. The two surviving British mediums pulled back, firing at the enemy machines. One of which erupted into flames. The squadron of British mediums by the destroyed Elephant gun battery bombarded the advancing Ottoman light land ships. But were unable to do any damage. In response, two Ottoman medium squadrons advanced and fired. And one British machine was knocked out. Over on the Ottoman far left, some of the British lancers and dragoons pulled back to regroup, while others counterattacked. Shells flew and 3 Ottoman light land ships and a medium were knocked out. But the Ottoman 55th Cavalry Regiment, along with mediums in support, responded with overwhelming firepower. Destroying a dozen of the British light land ships. The British counterattack was over. On the Ottoman right, massed, unbloodied light land ship squadrons from the 55th Regiment advanced behind the Jafu, who launched another frontal assault on the British Hussars and the last British heavy. While dozens of tribesmen fell, so too did the Hussars. The Jafu who attempted to board the British heavy were kept at bay by British Marines, but casualties were taken on both sides. Destroyed machines littered the battlefield, and the air was thick with black smoke and the cries of the wounded. British biplanes attacked another Ottoman gun battery and caused yet more chaos and confusion. The last of the British landships steamed away from the Jaffou, firing its stern cannon as it did so, but for little effect. The British carrier then opened fire on the tribesmen, and sent several to their maker. General Dermez's carrier maneuvered around the two destroyed British heavy landships so as to better target the retreating British carrier. The Ottoman war machine scored a number of hits and ignited the enemy carrier's fuel tanks, and the British flagship soon ground to a halt in flames. General Winkworth remained in the wheelhouse, intending to go down with his ship. The Ottoman biplanes that remained engaged the British. In the dogfight that followed, the Ottoman biplanes were wiped out, but took 3 of the British machines with them. In the center of the battlefield, a squadron of mediums maneuvered so as to protect the last of the heavies. They then split their fire between the Jaffou and the Ottoman carrier. And while they killed some tribesmen, they were unable to hurt the enemy flagship. 3 more British mediums retreated, firing on the advancing enemy landships. But their shells bounced harmlessly off the armor plating. Ottoman mediums poured through the gaps created by the retreat. Destroying 2 of the British machines. On the Ottoman left, 2 British mediums pulled back and fired. Blowing up an enemy medium. What remained of the 7th Dragoons and the 12th Lancers launched another heroic counterattack into the flanks of the advancing waves of enemy. When their cannon fire proved ineffective, the Dragoons and Lancers rammed their machines into the Ottomans, and a number of enemy vehicles were destroyed as a result. It was, however, not enough to blunt the enemy attack or sap his will. And the 12 Lancers and the 7th Dragoons were all but wiped out by the 2 squadrons of medium land ships supporting the Ottoman lights. Despite its ultimate failure, 2 Victoria Crosses were later awarded for this action. Over on the Ottoman right, the Zeppelins engaged and destroyed the last of the British airships, which went down fighting. As mass squadrons of the Ottoman 55th Cavalry Regiment advanced unopposed on the British left flank, General Dermez's carrier advanced over the wrecked machines of the 4th Hussars, followed by the last operational Ottoman heavy. General Dermez's carrier and the Ottoman heavy landship destroyed one of the last remaining British mediums before steaming on. Hoping to get out of range of the enemy guns, the British heavy continued to retreat. On the Ottoman left, squadron after squadron of medium and light landships steamed forward. And targeted the escaping British heavy. In the massive barrage that followed, the British heavy was destroyed. 2 British mediums fired back, knocking out an Ottoman medium before one of their own was destroyed. Now running low on ammunition, the British biplanes blew up the last howitzer battery. In the center of the battle, 3 British mediums kept fighting. Crippling another enemy medium. But the reality was that Ottoman forces were advancing in force across the board, and the British had little to stop them. Soon another 2 British mediums were on fire and orders given to abandon ship. And all the while the 55th Cavalry Regiment swept around the unprotected British left flank. You didn't need to have graduated from Sandhurst College to see that the writing was on the wall for the British. And so, with just 3 working landships, commanders decided to throw in the towel, hoisting bedsheets to act as white flags. White flags not being issued to Imperial expeditionary forces. The 27th Lancashire Fusiliers, forgotten about in their trench, surrendered as well. The Battle of the Boundary Marker was over, The entire action had lasted a little under an hour. Such was the destructiveness of steam-powered warfare. With the fighting dying down, General Dermez ordered his carrier to close with its British counterpart. A boarding action by Ottoman jump pack Marines conducted. The Union Jack removed, and the Ottoman flag raised in its place. Then General Dermez and Badim Umet, chief of the Jafu, came aboard. As Ottoman regulars and tribesmen celebrated their victory, General Winkworth handed Dermez his sword, mumbling as he did so about how jolly unfair it was to open fire without warning the other side first. The Ottomans sent the British landships they could repair east to Damascus, along with General Winkworth and the other British prisoners of war. Upon arrival at Damascus, the captured British landships were put on display in the main square. A few days later, General Winkworth was taken by train to Constantinople, where he remained for many years a prisoner of the Sultan. On his eventual release, he returned to London, resigned from the army, and became a leading estate agent. Of the entire British force deployed at the boundary marker, only 2 elephants and their handlers made it to the town of Taba, where they described, in rather poor English, the men, not the elephants, the terrible defeat. Back at the boundary marker, General Dermez gathered all the Ottoman landships that hadn't been destroyed or badly damaged in the fighting, and set off at full speed towards Taba. The Jafu tribesmen, their scimitars flashing in the desert sun, leading the way.